I didn't set out to flood 85 homes. All I did was lock a drain that legally belongs to me. 48 hours later, Ridgefall Summit looked like a disaster zone. Police cruisers idled at the entrance. Board members were sprinting between houses. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Neighbors, who had never spoken to me, were suddenly pounding on my front door like I'd sabotaged the whole hillside. But here's what nobody mentioned while they were pointing fingers. That drain they were panicking about. It had been buried all winter under a mountain of plowed snow, not by accident, not by nature, by the HOA's own contractor, following the board's cost-cutting plan. I warned them in December. I warned them again in January. By March, there was nearly 12 feet of compacted ice sitting directly on top of the only storm intake protecting the entire neighborhood. When the early thaw came, that blockage turned my basement into a swimming pool. Twice, my furnace was destroyed. Boxes of family photos dissolved into pulp. The repair bill came out to $18,600. The board's response: "That's just the downside of living at the bottom of a hill." They called it topographical inconvenience. So I stopped asking. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to convince them to care. Instead, I opened the original easement agreement and read it line by line. It didn't say they could maintain the drain when convenient. It didn't say they could ignore it to save money. It said they were responsible for keeping it unobstructed at all times. So I enforced it. I installed a reinforced steel grate over the intake on my property. I secured it with a commercial lock. I sent a certified demand letter for damages and a written maintenance plan. They laughed. Then the temperature rose. Snow melted fast. Water rushed downhill. And when it reached my yard, it met a locked barrier. Within hours, the streets above me began to pool. Within a day, basements uphill were taking on water. Within 2 days, the same board that dismissed my losses was holding an emergency meeting about catastrophic runoff failure. That's when they realized something terrifying. The lowest house on the hill wasn't the weakest. It was the control point. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Grant Holloway. I am 59 years old, a widower, a former site engineer who spent 3 decades designing commercial drainage systems, parking structures, and municipal runoff plans. I understand gravity better than most people understand their own neighbors, and that matters. I live at the very bottom of Ridgefall Summit in Blackridge County, Montana. It is one of those carefully marketed hillside communities with stone entry signs, decorative street lamps, and strict landscaping rules about mailbox colors. 85 large, polished homes climb the slope above me in perfect rows. Then there is my house. Older, smaller, original to the land before the development expanded uphill, and running across the lower edge of my backyard is a 24-inch reinforced concrete storm culvert intake. It is not decorative. It is not optional. It is the only engineered drainage point for the entire hillside. Every gutter, every driveway slope, every yard. All of it eventually flows downhill to me. When I purchased this house 12 years ago, I reviewed the property file carefully. Engineers have trust issues. The drainage easement language was direct and legally tight. The Ridgefall Summit Homeowners Association was responsible for proactive maintenance to ensure unobstructed flow access at all times, not when convenient, not after a complaint, at all times. For 10 years it worked exactly as designed. Snow was hauled off-site. Debris was cleared quarterly. The system breathed the way infrastructure is supposed to breathe. Then Darla Whitmore won the HOA presidency. Darla had a background in corporate compliance. She spoke in spreadsheets. She loved efficiency charts. At her first annual meeting, she said the phrase, "cost optimization strategy," no fewer than 7 times. That winter, she renegotiated the snow removal contract. The old contractor used to haul excess snow to an off-site melt field 5 miles away. It cost more, but it worked. The new contractor, hired under Darla's revised budget, had a different strategy: push it downhill. The first time I saw the plow trucks stacking snow near my fence line, I walked out and flagged the driver down. "You can't pile it there," I said calmly. "That's the drainage intake." He shrugged. "Board told us to clear streets fast." "That's the designated push zone." Designated push zone. I sent an email that night to the board. Attached photos. Marked the culvert in red. Explained exactly what would happen during thaw conditions if the intake became compacted. No response. A week later, the pile had doubled. I sent another message, this time certified mail. I printed the easement clause and highlighted the section requiring proactive obstruction prevention. I included a short, professional explanation of hydrostatic pressure buildup and backflow risk. Silence. By late January, the snow mound had transformed into something closer to a glacier. Layer after layer of plowed accumulation compressed into dense, dirty ice, nearly 12 feet high. It completely buried the culvert opening. I walked the hill one afternoon and looked upward at the 85 homes above me, roof lines cutting against the pale winter sky, smoke drifting from chimneys, families inside, warm and unaware. All of that meltwater had only one engineered exit, and it was now sealed under compacted ice. I tried one more time. I attended the February HOA board meeting. Darla stood at the front of the clubhouse, beside a projector screen showing budget projections. When the floor opened for comments, I stood. "The drainage intake at the base of my property is obstructed," I said. "If we get an early thaw, there will be backflow. It will not be contained to my yard." Darla gave me a tight smile. "Our contractor assured us the snow placement meets operational efficiency standards." "That is not an engineering term," I replied. A few homeowners shifted uncomfortably. Most looked bored. It was winter. The roads were clear. The sun was still weak. Flooding felt theoretical. Darla closed the discussion with, "We appreciate your concern, Grant. We'll monitor the situation." Monitor. That word stayed with me, because monitoring and preventing are not the same thing. By mid-February, temperatures began fluctuating. Warm afternoons, hard freezes at night. The snow mound over the culvert hardened into solid, immovable mass. Even if they wanted to clear it at that point, it would require heavy equipment. No one came. In early March, the weather report predicted an unseasonably warm front. 3 consecutive days above freezing. I stood in my backyard that morning and looked at the wall of ice sealing the only exit for 85 properties. Water follows physics, and physics does not negotiate with homeowner associations. When the thaw began, the first trickles ran down the hill exactly as designed. They just had nowhere to go. The first flood started at 3 in the morning. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first, a deep, hollow gurgling echoing through the floor vents. For a split second I thought it was wind. Then I heard the unmistakable slap of water hitting concrete. I was out of bed before I was fully awake. By the time I reached the basement stairs, cold air was rising up at me, damp and metallic. I flipped the light on. Water was shooting up through the floor drain like it had been forced there under pressure. Not a leak, not a trickle. A surge. It splashed against the furnace unit and spread outward in fast, moving sheets across the concrete floor. I ran for towels out of instinct, then realized how useless that was. Within minutes, the lower half of the basement was underwater. Storage boxes I had stacked carefully along the far wall began to sag and collapse. Those boxes held the last physical pieces of my life before my wife passed away. Old photographs, holiday decorations she insisted on labeling in neat handwriting, letters, receipts from vacations we took decades ago. Cardboard does not survive standing water. By sunrise, I had nearly 2 inches of water covering the entire basement floor. The furnace was soaked. The water heater pilot light had gone out. Everything smelled like mud and insulation. I stood there in boots, staring at the damage, and felt something shift inside me. Not panic. Recognition. This was exactly what I had warned them about. I called Darla at 8 in the morning. I kept my voice steady and explained what had happened. I told her the culvert was still buried. I told her meltwater had nowhere to discharge. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, calm and flat, "Well, Grant, that's what happens when you live at the bottom of a hill." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. "I live at the bottom," I replied, "because the drainage system was engineered to function." Another pause. "We'll make a note of your concern," she said. A note. I hung up before I said something I would regret. The insurance adjuster came 2 days later. He didn't need long to calculate it. Furnace replacement, electrical inspection, water remediation, damage storage, labor. $18,600. My deductible alone was enough to sting. But what burned more was knowing this was avoidable. Entirely preventable. The snow mound over the intake had not moved. 2 weeks later, the temperature climbed again. Another rapid thaw. I watched the slope carefully that time. I could actually see streams of meltwater carving channels through lawns, flowing down driveways, converging toward the same block point. At 11 that night, I heard it again, the gurgling. This time I was already dressed. The second flood was worse. The drain couldn't handle the pressure buildup. Water erupted faster, spreading farther. It reached the wooden shelving along the side wall. It soaked the lower insulation behind the drywall. I didn't feel shock this time. I felt clarity. This was no longer an accident. It was negligence. I attended the next HOA meeting that Thursday evening. The clubhouse was packed. 85 homeowners in folding chairs, coffee cups in hand, discussing landscaping plans and summer paint guidelines. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front with printed photos. I held up the first image. Water surrounding my furnace. "This is from 2 weeks ago," I said. Then the second photo, boxes collapsed, soaked through. "This is from Monday night." The room grew quiet. I read the easement clause out loud, slowly, word for word. I emphasized the line requiring proactive maintenance to prevent obstruction. Darla stood beside the projector screen with her hands clasped in front of her. When I finished, she gave a small, rehearsed smile. "Alternative snow hauling," she said, addressing the room, "would increase annual dues by approximately 8%. The board evaluated the financial impact and voted against that expense." A few homeowners nodded automatically. 8%. That was the number that mattered to them. Not $18,600 in damage. Not destroyed property. Not structural risk. 8%. I looked around the room at my neighbors. Most of them had no idea the entire drainage system depended on a single intake on my land. They had never been told snow was being stacked there to save money. "So flooding my home is the cost-saving measure?" I asked. Darla's expression hardened slightly. "We are monitoring the situation." There was that word again. Monitoring. I realized something in that moment. They believed I would keep absorbing it, keep paying deductibles, keep cleaning up water, keep being reasonable. They believed that because I lived at the bottom, I had no leverage. I went home that night and set up a file folder on my desk. Every email, every certified letter receipt, every photograph with timestamps, weather reports, damage invoices, insurance assessments. I printed the development plans from county records, highlighted the drainage flow diagrams, marked the culvert location. I stopped calling Darla. I stopped trying to convince the board. Instead, I prepared. Because if they wanted to reduce my flooded basement to a budget line item, I was going to show them what the true cost of monitoring looked like. And this time, the water would not be contained to my side of the hill. The morning after the second flood, I drove down to the Blackridge County Records office. I did not go there angry. I went there focused. The Ridge Fall Summit development was filed in 2006, back when the hillside was first carved into tiers of lots and asphalt roads. I requested the full subdivision packet, plats, engineering reports, drainage schematics, easement agreements, board responsibilities. The clerk handed me a thick binder that hadn't been opened in years. I took it to a wooden table under a humming fluorescent light and started turning pages. Site grading plans, stormwater calculations, runoff modeling, and then I found the master easement declaration. It was not vague, it was not buried in legal fog. It was clear, deliberate language drafted by engineers and attorneys who understood risk. The association is responsible for proactive maintenance, ensuring unobstructed drainage access at all times. I read that line 3 times. Proactive. Not after notification. Not within reasonable response time. Proactive. That word carried weight. In engineering, proactive maintenance means anticipating failure points and preventing them before damage occurs. It means clearing the intake before snow compacts into ice. It means ensuring flow capacity is protected before meltwater builds pressure. The HOA had not merely responded slowly. They had failed their core obligation. I photocopied the relevant sections, including the hydraulic flow diagram showing exactly how runoff from all 85 homes converged toward the culvert crossing my yard. The diagram made it impossible to deny the dependency. Everything above me relied on that intake functioning without obstruction. On the drive home, I called someone I had not spoken to in years, Trent Maddox. We used to work together on municipal site projects when we were younger. While I stayed in engineering, Trent went to law school. He now practiced property and land use law in Cedar Bluffs, about 40 minutes away. He agreed to meet me the next afternoon. His office overlooked a small river that was still partially frozen. When I walked in, he greeted me like no time had passed. I laid everything on his desk: the photos of flooding, the insurance estimate, the snow mound, the highlighted easement clause. He flipped through the documents methodically, tapping the page where the key language appeared. Proactive maintenance, he said quietly. That's not accidental wording. No. I replied. It isn't. He leaned back in his chair. Grant, they're in breach. And they've been in breach all winter. Hearing someone else say it out loud did something to me. It removed doubt. This wasn't about overreacting. It wasn't about personal conflict with Darla. It was structural negligence. Can we sue? I asked. Slowly, yes. You could file for damages, possibly injunctive relief. But lawsuits take time, months, sometimes years. I pictured another winter, another thaw, another flooded basement. That doesn't fix the immediate problem, I said. Trent agreed. It doesn't. He stood and walked to a whiteboard mounted on the wall. With a marker, he drew a quick diagram of the hillside, 85 boxes above, 1 small square below. You have something they don't, he said. I replied dryly. He smiled slightly. Control point. He circled the square at the bottom. They depend on infrastructure located on your land. That means access to that infrastructure is governed by the easement, and easements come with reciprocal obligations. I crossed my arms. I'm not interested in sabotaging anyone. Good, he said, because sabotage would hurt you too. What I'm talking about is leverage. There was that word, leverage. Infrastructure, Trent continued, is only invisible when it works. The moment it doesn't, everyone notices. If the association has failed to meet its proactive duty, you are not required to continue providing unprotected access while they remain in breach. I understood immediately. You're saying I can secure the intake, I said carefully. I'm saying, Trent replied, choosing his words, that if the association is violating the terms of the easement, you have the right to demand compliance. And until compliance is restored, you are not obligated to facilitate their negligence. We discussed it for nearly 2 hours. He walked me through the boundaries. What would be considered reasonable enforcement versus unlawful obstruction? The key was documentation and formal notice. No impulsive action, no emotional retaliation, everything in writing. If you go this route, Trent said, you send a certified demand letter first. You outline the breach. You specify corrective action and damages. You give them a defined window to respond. If they refuse, then you implement protective measures. Protective measures, not revenge, protection. I thought about Darla standing in that meeting room, smiling while explaining that 8% dues were more important than structural prevention. I thought about the smell of wet insulation in my basement. If they wanted to treat the culvert like it didn't matter, I said slowly, then maybe they need to understand exactly how much it matters. Trent nodded. That's leverage. When I left his office, I didn't feel angry. I felt steady. Back at home, I stood in my yard looking at the massive wall of compacted snow still sealing the intake. The ice was dirty now, streaked with sand and debris from the road. Meltwater trickled along its edges but could not penetrate. Above me, 85 houses sat quiet in the late afternoon light. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Kids rode bikes in driveways. Lawns were beginning to show patches of green. None of them were thinking about that buried culvert. None of them understood that every gallon of water coming off their property passed through a single engineered opening on mine. If the board wanted to gamble with that system to save money, they had made a calculation. What they had not calculated was that the person living at the lowest point understood exactly how gravity works, and I was done absorbing the consequences of their shortcuts. I had a custom steel grate made, industrial grade, reinforced, built to withstand anything. I mounted it over the culvert intake and secured it with a commercial, weatherproof lock, the kind that makes even the most persistent intruder think twice. Then came the paperwork, a certified demand letter to the HOA, meticulously detailed $18,600 in damages, a formal snow relocation plan, quarterly inspections, and a 15-year compliance agreement. I made it clear if they didn't comply within 14 days, the access stayed locked. They laughed. Darla even had the nerve to email me, "You cannot hold the community hostage." I didn't reply. 4 days later, a warm front moved in. Snow melted at a shocking pace. Water streamed downhill, surging against my lock grate, backing up, refusing to follow the path the HOA expected. The culvert was useless, and the water settled, right where I had predicted, right above them. That's when the phone started ringing. Calls from board members, frantic, unsure. Emails flooded in, each one more desperate than the last. Suddenly, the HOA that had dismissed my demands as ridiculous now had to confront the very consequences they had ignored. I stayed calm, watching, letting the chaos unfold while remaining perfectly untouchable behind my steel and lock. The water didn't just sit quietly. It pooled and pressed, a silent force of inevitability. Every frozen inch of snow that had stubbornly resisted removal was now in motion, obeying the rules I had set, not theirs. The community's complaints turned to panic as they realized they had no immediate solution, no quick fix. Their arrogance met its match in something as simple as gravity and steel. Darla called at noon, her voice a mix of anger and pleading. "This is ridiculous. We need that culvert open now," I let her words hang, no apology, no compromise. Just the sound of her frustration echoing against the reality she had ignored. By evening, other board members joined the chorus, proposing plans, promising action, all while the grate stood firm, immovable, unyielding. The snow melted, the water flowed, but only on my terms. The lesson was clear. Control isn't about titles, meetings, or threats. Control is about preparation, patience, and the quiet knowledge that when you're right, you don't have to raise your voice. For the first time, the HOA realized they weren't negotiating with a neighbor. They were confronting consequences. Every demand they had dismissed, every laugh at my expense, every scoff at compliance agreements, it came full circle in the form of rising water and unanswered questions. I didn't gloat. I watched. I documented. Every call, every email, every frantic request was proof that diligence and foresight outweigh arrogance and entitlement. 4 days had been enough. 4 days had turned mockery into urgency, laughter into pleading. By nightfall, Darla's last email arrived. "Well, we need to discuss this immediately. Can we meet?" I had no plans to meet yet. Patience was part of the strategy. Let them sweat. Let them realize the limits of their power. My lock, my rules, my terms. The steel grate didn't just secure a culvert, it secured clarity. It made one thing unmistakable. Respect isn't demanded through yelling or legal loopholes. It's earned, quietly, decisively, and sometimes with a lock that refuses to budge. And in that silence, as the water finally began to flow downstream, I felt it. The satisfaction of finally being in complete control. The HOA had learned a lesson they couldn't ignore, and I hadn't lifted a finger beyond design, installation, and documentation. Sometimes, the simplest measures are the most powerful. The right steel, the right lock, the right timing. It's enough to turn arrogance into action and inaction into accountability. The phone kept ringing, but I no longer rushed to answer. Let them talk. Let them scramble. I already knew how this story ended. The lock held, the water obeyed, and for the first time in this battle, the balance of power had shifted unmistakably. By the second day, streets were already turning into shallow rivers, water pooling along curbs and seeping into driveways. By the third, 2 uphill basements were showing early signs of seepage, drywall darkening, carpets dampening. Whispers turned to complaints. The neighborhood that had once dismissed my concerns now faced undeniable evidence of what happens when infrastructure is ignored. By the 4th day, Darla arrived at my door, not alone but flanked by 3 board members. Her posture was tight, controlled, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "This is dangerous," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "No," I replied, calm and steady. "Ignoring infrastructure is dangerous." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than expected, and for a moment, even Darla couldn't counter them. She glanced at her colleagues, searching for backup, but found none. An emergency HOA meeting was called that evening. The tension in the room was palpable. Residents filled the space, voices rising, frustration spilling out like the very water that had now crept into their basements. They were angry, not just at the flooding, but at the realization that they had never been informed about the easement clause in the first place. They had never been told that snow dumping, conveniently billed as cost-cutting, carried serious risk. Darla tried to regain control, attempting to paint me as the unreasonable one, a neighborhood troublemaker making mountains out of mollyhills. But the room wasn't buying it. Then Trent stood up, quietly, with no fanfare, no drama, just facts. He read aloud the breach language from the HOA's governing documents, outlining exactly how obligations had been neglected. He explained, step by step, the legal exposure the board now faced, carefully citing precedent and the potential consequences of negligent oversight. His voice didn't waver, and each word landed like a weight in the room. He said the phrase that silenced the murmurs and shifted glances: negligent governance. The room changed in that instant. Faces that had been confident, dismissive, even mocking, tightened. The board members who had laughed at my earlier letters were now visibly uncomfortable. Darla's fingers fidgeted with her pen. Her voice faltered when she tried to interrupt. This wasn't about inconvenience anymore. It wasn't about a locked grate or a few angry emails. It was about legal responsibility, about accountability, about the very real possibility that the HOA could be held liable for every flooded basement, every property damage claim, every moment of panic that the community had endured. Residents leaned in, some nodding, some whispering among themselves. The gravity of Trent's words resonated in every corner of the room. They had trusted the board to manage risk, to plan for seasons, to anticipate problems. But the truth was now undeniable that trust had been breached. For the first time, the board wasn't just defending policy. They were defending themselves. Every smile, every attempt at charm or diversion evaporated under the weight of documented negligence and rising frustration. I remained seated, observing, calm, watching the tide turn. The panic in the room wasn't theatrical. It was real. Fear of legal exposure, fear of angry homeowners, fear of consequences that no amount of denial could erase. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had a new agenda: immediate corrective action. Snow relocation plans would be revised. Culvert access would be prioritized. Quarterly inspections, previously ignored, were now non-negotiable. And for the first time, Darla and her team understood that infrastructure wasn't optional. It was the backbone of the entire community. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over Ridgefall's summit. Streets were still wet, basements still damp, but momentum had shifted. The community now had a board that would act, or at least a board aware that inaction carried consequences they could no longer ignore. Sometimes, it takes a crisis to make people see clearly. Sometimes patience and preparation outpace arrogance and denial. And sometimes, the smallest actions, a steel grate, a certified letter, a careful explanation of liability, can turn fear into accountability, chaos into order. The room had been silent as Trent spoke, but the echoes of his words would linger far longer than any argument, any email, or any casual dismissal. Ridgefall's summit would never forget this moment, and neither would I. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected. 3 homeowners, frustrated and cornered, threatened independent lawsuits, not against me, not against a neighbor, but directly against the HOA itself. That phrase alone hung in the air like a guillotine. Suddenly, Darla wasn't defending policy, infrastructure, or community planning. She was defending herself. Within 48 hours, the landscape of Ridgefall's summit had shifted completely. The massive snow mound, once ignored, was professionally removed. The culvert access, once contested, was now free-flowing. The HOA wired full payment for my documented damages, no questions, no delays. They signed the 15-year maintenance contract without hesitation. Each signature a tacit acknowledgement that their prior negligence had put everyone at risk. And then Darla resigned, officially, for personal reasons, though everyone knew the real story. Her departure was swift, almost anticlimactic, but its ripple effect was immediate. Leadership changes followed. At the next community vote, the board was restructured, putting in place members who understood that infrastructure, responsibility, and transparency were not optional. Quarterly inspections became mandatory, a system to ensure that problems would be identified before they became disasters. Budget transparency became public, giving residents insight into decisions that had previously been opaque, unaccountable. The community had learned that oversight wasn't just bureaucratic red tape. It was the difference between order and chaos. Once the written compliance agreements were verified, I unlocked the grate. The water that had lingered above the culvert for days drained within hours, flowing exactly as nature intended. Streets cleared, basements dried, and the threat of rising water vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. For Ridgefall Summit, the lesson was stark and unavoidable. Gravity always wins, and infrastructure cannot be ignored. Plans, agreements, and locks may seem mundane or excessive, but when leveraged properly, they enforce accountability where words and meetings fail. Residents began to speak differently, no longer underestimating what careful planning and diligence could achieve. The story of the lock culvert became a quiet parable for the community, a reminder that control is not about title, ego, or threats. It is about foresight, preparation, and the courage to act when others refuse. The neighborhood had endured 4 tense, transformative days. By the end, the water had drained, the snow had disappeared, and the HOA had been humbled. What started as a simple infrastructure dispute had turned into a powerful demonstration of cause and effect, of patience and persistence, of accountability enforced not through confrontation alone, but through deliberate, undeniable action. Ridgefall Summit had learned to respect consequences, systems, and gravity itself, and as I watched the last runoff disappear into the culvert, I understood that the quietest moves often create the loudest lessons. No meetings could replicate this clarity. No angry email or rant could replace the power of preparation, planning, and a steel grate with a lock. The community would remember it, not for the conflict itself, but for the moment everything changed, and how simple measures, executed at the right time, can collapse control and restore order in ways words never could. After everything had settled, the community at Ridgefall Summit was quietly different. Neighbors who had never exchanged more than a nod now stopped by, curious or grateful, or maybe just realizing I hadn't been exaggerating all along. One of the families uphill admitted their basement had nearly flooded. They had no idea the drainage system even ran through my yard. No idea that what I'd been warning about wasn't paranoia, it was infrastructure reality. The new HOA president, Mark Ellison, approached me with something that would have been unthinkable under Darla's leadership. He asked for my input on future infrastructure planning. He listened. He took notes. He understood that a neighborhood isn't a hierarchy, it's a system of shared responsibility. The snow contractor contract was rewritten to include off-site removal, ensuring that piles of melting snow would never threaten the culvert again. Funds were allocated specifically for preventive maintenance. Quarterly inspections weren't just a formality, they were a mandate. Every winter since, the system worked as intended. Streets stayed clear, basements stayed dry. My own basement remained untouched, the quiet proof of long-term planning. But the real victory wasn't in the contracts or inspections. It was in the culture. People stopped seeing me as the lone, nitpicking neighbor at the bottom of the hill. They began to see the system itself, the drainage, the culvert, the shared responsibility, as something bigger than individual ego. It was something that belonged to all of them, a network of trust and foresight. Conversations changed. Complaints became collaborative problem-solving. Meetings became about solutions, not blame. The air of entitlement and dismissal that had defined the previous leadership dissipated, replaced by accountability and engagement. Even Darla's departure, once a source of quiet tension, became a symbol. Neglect has consequences, but preparation and persistence pay off. I kept the steel grate for years, not out of spite, but as a reminder, a quiet, tangible proof of what happens when patience, planning, and persistence intersect. Neighbors no longer viewed me as a disruptor. They began to see me, and the system, as partners in maintaining the community's safety and value. Ridgefall Summit had learned its lesson in the most undeniable way possible. Gravity cannot be ignored, systems cannot be bypassed, and responsibility is not optional. And for the first time, the culture of the community reflected that truth. Mutual respect replaced assumption. Cooperation replaced neglect. Accountability replaced arrogance. In the end, it wasn't just about water or snow. It was about understanding that a neighborhood is more than houses on a hill. It's a living network of people, systems, and foresight. And when everyone recognizes that the small actions, the contracts, the inspections, the locks, the letters, become part of a larger, enduring legacy of safety, trust, and shared responsibility, the culvert flowed freely, basement stayed dry, streets cleared, and Ridgefall Summit, once divided by ignorance and arrogance, finally functioned like a true community. The hill remained steep, the winters still heavy, but the lessons had sunk deep, and everyone, from the new board to the quietest resident, knew that some battles, fought with patience, preparation, and principle, could change everything. Sometimes people think power comes from titles, from being HOA president, from controlling budgets, from winning board votes. But real power, it comes from knowing the fine print, from patience, from documentation, from understanding exactly how small choices ripple into big consequences, from recognizing when it's time to stop absorbing everyone else's runoff, literally and figuratively. I never wanted 85 homes to feel panic. I just wanted them to understand consequence. Because when small responsibilities are ignored, they don't vanish. They build pressure, quietly, invisibly, until eventually that pressure finds a way to move. And in Ridgefall Summit, it flowed uphill. Preparation, foresight, and persistence. Those are the tools that truly shift control. Titles and votes can't match the quiet power of being ready, of acting with precision, and of letting natural consequences speak for themselves. If you want more stories like this, where patience, principle, and a little strategic steel change the game, make sure to hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Ridgefall Summit learned its lesson in a way no meeting ever could. And now, so can you.